Morning. Okay, I do not think that I'm the center of the universe most days. But I do think God has a sense of humor. So I'm sitting, I have this practice I do when I preach, that the last thing I do on Sunday mornings, one's a very practical thing. The second is because I know where my help comes from. Is I go to Waffle House. And maybe you have to go somewhere quiet to pray and to gather your thoughts. Quiet doesn't do well for me. I need a lot of distraction so I can really focus in on what I'm talking about. And if that scares you, you might want to leave now before the sermon actually starts. But so I'm at Waffle House and I'm praying, and the other thing that I do logistically, because I know this is going to shock all of you. Sometimes I talk a little longer than I had anticipated. Yeah. And so what I do is I go through to the each one of the things that the main ideas of what I'm going to say, and I try to, in 1 minute, summarize every main idea. So you see, I could be preaching for 2 hours if I didn't do that. That was supposed to be funny. Okay, but I do think God has a sense of humor. So I was doing that this morning, open Waffle House, wherever that is, this way. Yeah. And and so here's the thing that happened. I'm sitting there, and while I'm doing that, I'm having a little technical difficulty this morning. Closer to my mouth. Okay. All right. How's that? I don't know. Let's just see how that does, shall we? So I'm sitting there, and I'm really intent. Obviously, I was looking incredibly spiritual as I was reading my Bible and praying, and I'm thinking through the teaching for today. And I didn't realize it, but the waitresses were throwing syrups and butters at me because they saw how intent I was on what was going on. Now, understand, they're telling me the story. I didn't know this. They threw 4 things, and finally one of them had the guts to throw a jelly and hit me right in between the eyes. And they said, "Tim, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm just focused." Now, here's the funny thing about it is in the process of what I'll talk with you about this morning, this whole idea of New Year's resolutions and looking towards a new year, one of the particular part that I was looking at that moment to make sure that I got it really communicated well had to do with 2 things. Number one, that there's a lot of distractions in this world, but that one important thing you do as you think towards a new year and as any resolutions you might set is that you need to be aware of what's going on around you. Because if you don't, you're liable to get hit by something, which was literally in my script. And they're throwing things, and then I pointed out that the reason a lot of people fail in their resolutions is because they aren't aware of everything else that's going on around them. Well, can you appreciate the irony of it? And as soon as it happened, I said, "Lord, really? Is this the only thing I'm supposed to say today? Because this is a pretty visual lesson." God has an incredible sense of humor. Of course, I tried to share with them the irony of that. And they just said, "Oh, this wasn't anything from God. We were just trying to be annoying." So in that, indeed, they were. But when you start thinking about expectations for the new year, I just want you to think with me this morning. And I'm going to tell you from the very beginning, you're going to be frustrated at the front end of this. Because when we start thinking about the new year and what everybody expects for the new year, you hear phrases like this: dream about the new you. See the you that you want to be. Change your life. Oh, by the way, don't blow it the same way you did last year. Ignore your past and make a plan that lasts. Doesn't that sound so honorable, so encouraging, so, whatever? Well, I got interested to find out where resolutions, like New Year's resolutions, actually came from. Because I didn't know. And one of the things I found out is that the Babylonians started the whole thing. They would make promises to their pagan god at the start of each year, and then they would return all the objects they had borrowed and pay off their debts. The Romans picked it up, and they began each year making promises to their god Janus, who actually is where we get the name eventually for January, for the month of January. And then medieval knights would do a thing called the peacock vow. You don't want to know why. But it was the peacock vow at the end of the Christmas season each year to reaffirm their commitment to chivalry. Well, okay, whatever. But I thought it might be good if you look quickly with me with some statistics about New Year's resolutions. There are about 10 things, the biggies: lose weight, get organized, spend less money, enjoy life, get healthy, learn something, quit smoking, help others, fall in love, and more family time. Well, those are the biggies. Now, about 45% of Americans will make a New Year's resolution. Let's see how the statistic goes. How many of you made a New Year's resolution? You can raise your hand if you did. Well, okay, you guys just broke my whole sermon because there's not 45% of you that made a New Year's resolution. Well, here's the interesting thing. You know, we complain about 20-somethings all the time and how they broke the world. No offense, guys. But 39% of 20-somethings that make a resolution will actually keep them for the whole entire year. So there. Those of you that are 50-somethings, bad news for you. Only 14% of you will actually keep your resolution for the entire year. And while that looks bad, 46% of the people that make any kind of resolution will actually let it. It will last for 6 months, but after that it goes downhill, because only 8% of the people that make resolutions will actually keep them a year or further. Timothy Cycle, who's a professor of psychology at Carleton University in Canada, he did a lot of research on this, and he basically says this, that resolutions are a form of cultural procrastination. How encouraging is that? All this emphasis we've had all these years on it, and it's just one big cultural way to procrastinate. He said it's a way to reinvent oneself. He argues that people really have no desire to change their habits, and especially bad ones, and that accounts for the bad failure. But if you make a resolution, it's just a nice way of being able to procrastinate, because you did involve yourself in the conversation of cultural procrastination. He goes on to say this, we also use resolutions to motivate ourselves. The question might come, why do we wait till the new year to make these resolutions? Well, it's real simple. I don't do complicated, and obviously this guy knew I was going to be using his quote. He said it's because the word new appears in New Year's resolutions. The truth is, he says, from their research, people are not ready to make a change, and to change anything in life, and they make resolutions to force them to change. But of course, they're not ready to make a change, so they don't, and it gets worse, because there's another researcher, psychologist, who says this, Peter Herman and his colleagues have now identified the false hope syndrome. Now, he says it in a very significantly impressive way when he says their resolution is significantly unrealistic and out of alignment with their internal view of themselves. Now, those of you that need a translation for that, this is what the fellow's saying. When you make positive affirmations that don't really match what you believe on the inside, not only do they not work, but they're damaging to your self-esteem, and a lot of people revert back to their old behavior, which is why we have such a low success rate on making New Year's resolutions. And the last one, there's a lady named Gabriella Ogden, and I'm sure she would be aghast at how I pronounced her name. She's a professor of psychology in New York University, and this is what she says. The more positively people fantasize and daydream about their future success, the less well they will do in terms of having actual success. Now, for those of you that are big goal setters and those of you that like setting New Year's goals, you don't have to go out there saying that I told you to never set another New Year's year resolution or never set another goal. She says it is a very positive thing to set a positive goal and look towards the potential of the future. But a lot of people now have begun to use these as fantasies. And she says while they're helpful for exploring the possibility for the future, they are a hardship when it comes to actually putting the effort into doing it. The bottom line, she says, is people live so much in the fantasy of the reality of what they've created in their mind about what they're going to be that it saps the energy from their ability to actually go do the thing. Now, I don't know about you, but I've heard about all the observations from studies that I can handle for the whole rest of the year here in the last 5 minutes. And all this does is leave me really frustrated, so I've come up with a solution about it. I've come up with a stress reduction kit. So this is what it is. I'm going to start putting these signs all over the campus here. And this is the way it works. I tried to find some way to make this little guy hit the wall, but you place the kit on a very firm surface that's really solid in the back. And if you want one of these, I'll be glad to send one home with you today. You follow the directions in the circle, which is, say it with me, bang, head, here. Now you do that 2 to 4 times, depending on what's necessary, until you pass out. Once you pass out, you can cease the stress reduction activity. When I hear all these statistics and all this information about setting New Year's Eve resolutions, this is what I want to do. So what am I supposed to do? Do them or not do them? Set a goal or not set a goal? Last year they told me I needed to envision myself towards a goal that I'm going towards, and it will come to pass. And there's a whole lot of other teaching out there in the Christian world and in the secular world. Well, I do have good news for you. Those of you that are feeling like banging your head on the wall, especially if you're trying to lose weight, there's excellent news right now. Banging your head on the wall uses 150 calories an hour. So the good news is, if you're completely frustrated, I've at least got a decent diet plan for you this morning. But when I look to the scriptures, chapter 5, verses 15 to 16, and literally the problem I had this morning is narrowing down what I was going to talk about in terms of resolutions. And while I'm not going to give you a step 1, 2, 3, I hope I can give you some pointers if you're choosing to be a person of resolution this coming year. In Ephesians 5, 15 to 16, it says this. This morning on purpose, I'm using the New King James Version in my translation. We normally use the NIV or the ESV. He says, see then that you walk circumspectively, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Now, the reason I chose this particular passage in this particular version is I very much wanted to use the word circumspectively because it's not a word that we use all the time. Some of your versions would say, be very, very careful how you walk in this world. If you're not familiar with the context of chapter 5 of Ephesians, he begins the first chapter, part of the chapter, talking about living as children of light and how God's call on our life is that Christ's life has been deposited in us and we become a whole other person, and that we are quite literally to shed the light of Christ on this entire world that we are a part of. And then when the light of Christ and the light of truth is shed on that world, that it brings about healing. Now, it says many, many other things, but the context of the passage is about that. And so you come on this, so he says, walk circumspectively. And I used to, in another life, I used to spend my summers training kids to go into the wilderness and live off the land. And so we would take anybody from 7th graders all the way up through college people, and we would spend about 2 weeks in the wild discovering how to live off the land and hiking and canoeing and hunting and fishing and caving and all those kinds of things. And particularly with hiking, it's very important that you're careful about what you do. And And frankly, that image as I read this passage was very much in line because, excuse me, there are some things about hiking that sort of correlate with this whole idea of walking circumspectively. I want you to hear, although we could spend quite a little bit of time unpacking this passage, the first thing he says to do is walk. One of the biggest concerns that I had, so this is not a mad dash, is what I want you to hear. There was a lady when I was in the Amazon several years back that I had the privilege to meet just a few months before she died. And her story was this. She was 92 at that point. She had gone into the jungle. She had been in one of the larger metropolitan cities, had been a very successful businesswoman there in Brazil. And she decided to liquidate her home and all of her everything that she owned, put it in the bank so she could have just enough to exist on, and she spent the next 40 years living with a group of people there in the Amazon just as you go into the bush. This particular group of people had over 10,000, this tribe had over 10,000 people in it. And she went there to live because by the time she got there were just a few over 600. And the reason that those people had gone from 10,000 to just over 600 is because among the many things that were going on there that caused a great death rate, the entire tribe had become alcoholics. They made the alcohol from the roots of trees that were there in the Amazon. And of course, they didn't know the word alcoholic, but they literally had drank so much, or they drank so much, that they came to the place in their life where they had decimated their entire culture. And she went there doing nothing spectacular. She moved in with them, cared for them, and began to teach them the things, one that would take care of their physical body. You need to understand, when she moved in, these folks were just one generation away from being cannibals. And there were still some of the older people who didn't have any teeth anymore, who had actually participated in being cannibals. And so this lady invested her life for over 40 years, and as a result, the entire tribe came to know Christ as Savior. There were no fancy missionary organizations, although I'm glad there are many that are there. This one lady, in the simple things of life, said, I will devote myself to investing in the lives of people. And as a result, this tribe is growing again, and they are completely 100% committed to Christ. But what I want you to see, she was no great person. She was this simple woman who showed up in life to actually do the things that she was capable of and offered them to the living God to dramatically impact. You know what? No one will ever remember this woman's name. And if I hadn't been to this little village in the middle of the bush, you'd have never even heard about her. There were no mission organizations that were patting her on the back, and we discovered her simply by accident when we went to the market to get some food, and she was going in to take her last load of things over, like medicines and things like that, over to the folks that were there. You see, the God of this universe is looking to use people, not in a mad dash, but in the everyday things of life. It's people who are willing to reach others and to express the love and light of Christ, life on life. It's about a steady moving forward. It's interesting in 1 Timothy chapter 14, and we won't chapter 4, verse 12 and following. Paul's talking about to Timothy how to be a good example as a young man, and literally how to be a good minister of Christ Jesus. And one of the things he talks about, he uses in the King James Version, it says conversation. Some versions say in your everyday life, but he's talking to Timothy in terms of what he'll do and what his daily interaction with people will do in terms of his personal example. It's not about some big plan or being known as a big person like another Billy Graham, but instead it's walking in the everyday things of life. A good friend of mine used to say this: in lesser times, and we read about them in the Old Testament, and Randy's been preaching about some of those, God used greater men who did spectacular things. But in these greater times, in a time when more and more people are choosing not to follow Christ, God's going to use lesser men and women to dramatically impact just with their daily walks. Also, as you look at Scripture, it talks about living circumspectively. The idea of living circumspectively, when you go on a hike, how many of you ever done any hiking? A lot of hiking out in the woods. I don't mean just in a little waltz. I'm talking about in the woods, sleeping on the ground, fighting the bears. Well, when you're doing that, you're very careful about how you walk. And there's a couple of three things you do. One of them is you're always looking circumspectively. You're looking around, you're looking above, you're looking below, you're looking at what over's the next place, you're looking at what's behind you. And I told you that I did some work with kids, teaching them wilderness camping skills. We had this one kid, his name was Larry, and he was 7th grade, and he'd never been out of the 10-block area in Knoxville, Tennessee, where he was. And we took him into the mountains, and he was there with me for 2.5 weeks. Well, let's just say this boy had more energy than all the people in this room put together. And so when we started out, he was scared to death he's going to miss something, because he was so excited about what's happening. And he literally ran ahead of us. There were 15 of us, and he literally ran all the way up and got in front, and he ran all the way back to the end of the line of the hiking and all the way. He had to have gone 14 miles a day, and we were only hiking 6 or 7 because he's circling the whole time. And this is what he'd say. He says, listen, I don't want to miss anything. I don't want to make sure I get everything. And listen, I want to get, and he'd get up there, and he'd be afraid he was missing some of the fun in the back, so he'd run to the back. And it was back and forward and back and forward. Literally, he cracked a rib. He broke a finger. He skinned off the bottom of his chin. He skinned off both of his shoulders, both of his knees. And I think he cracked his big toe all on one trip. Because he never looked where he was going. He was going like a crazy man. He was unaware of what was going on around him. And the idea that Paul has here is that we're going through, as we're walking through life, and as you start thinking about your resolutions possibly, understand this, it's absolutely imperative that you be aware of everything that's going on around you, and you be careful about that. You should know what slows you down, including circumstances that are coming your way. You should be aware, or at least pray to be aware, of the hurt and the impact that others' behavior can have on you. And honestly, in a day and age, and you're going to hear me say this more than once, and everybody says, oh, it's all good. Do you know when we use the word all good? Sometimes we say, no, it's all good. We say it when we just don't care what's being talked about. But the truth is, there's a lot of us that use that when there's an issue that's as big as a giant boulder, and we don't want to look at it, and so we just don't want to engage somebody about it. So we say, no, it's all good. Because we don't want to engage the things of life. And we do that even about our own selves. So as I'm walking in this life, I walk circumspectively. I take very firm steps. One of the things you have to do when you're hiking is when you step, you always step flat-footed. And here's why. When you're hiking in the woods, you never know if there's a hole on the side of that rock that you're stepping on. You never know if the rock's going to go out from under you. So you need to be firm enough you can push off or to go somewhere else or to jump somewhere else or to jump back. It's just a part of hiking. It's part of being on the journey. We need to make, the author would be calling us to take very firm steps, because there's a lot of surprising things that happen along the way for us making our plans that have to do with the resolutions in our life. One of the things that I'm really bad at is I hate interruptions. Is there anybody else think like that? And here's the reason. I don't know why you hate interruptions. I hate interruptions because I'm not really that great at planning anyway. I mean, I would tell you that I am one of the planning impaired. And so when I finally do make a plan, and especially if it happens to be one that'll work, when you come along and interrupt me, sometimes I don't have a great attitude about that. How about you? But the reality is that everything that comes to us passes through the Lord's hands. I don't say we use that as an excuse to be lazy and to not to think anything about what we're doing for the future. But what I am telling you is if it passes through the Lord's hands, I can either get frustrated with that interruption or recognize that it is an opportunity that God is placing in front of me. Finally, I believe it's His call to keep our mind focused on exactly the right things. I won't go into detail about this, but excuse me, you guys have heard me talk a lot about my weight over the years, and just a few weeks back, the Lord actually, I say, showed me something. I understood something by His Spirit, and it was this. You may or may not know this, but about 6 years ago, my friend died, who was my mentor, and you've heard me mention him before. And since that time, I had put on 100 pounds in 6 years. That's generally not considered all that healthy. And so here's what generally happens when you go to set goals for a new year. Say, listen, Tim, you put on 100 pounds. You need to do something about that, bud. But you know that's not the biggest issue. Because what the Lord showed me is I was still grieving my friend from 6 years ago. Now and listen, I'm a good Southern boy. We make comfort food. We define what comfort food is. And so literally, I had let food and have let food become the source of my comfort. You say, well, Tim, that's no big deal. People have done that. Well, okay, I understand that. But it's still not been any help. And I'm not trying to get you mad about if you have extra weight on just like that I do. What I want you to see is that the problem with a lot of resolutions that we make is that we set our sights on the thing that is not the thing. It is not the main issue. And so I would call you this morning to recognize that Christ has called us to walk in a circumstantive way. To be very careful how I'm walking and evaluate things well. He says, here's why. He says to redeem the time. There's multiples of ways we can redeem the time. I just have a few here. One, the idea in the passage is that I buy up every possible moment that is needed. And there's this filter that I will look at all of life through. And the things that are most important in life get my attention, and all of my plans go through that filter. That I take advantage of every opportunity and squeeze every moment out. And I'm not saying that some of the opportunities are supposed to not, rest is a good thing in my life. But I take the advantage of every opportunity. Some of the things the scriptures that would talk about that would be redeeming the time is that I would make deliberate choices to shed the light of God in my own life and other people's lives. In the book of Ephesians chapter 5. That I would overcome evil with good, Romans chapter 12 to 21. That I would serve and encourage others, in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, who are actually struggling in life. That I would deal with trouble in the light of day, when trouble in this life and things that are difficult, or the light of truth of Christ is shed on them, the darkness has to go away. I would bear other burdens, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, because other people are struggling just like me. To redeem the time, and he says very simply this, don't just redeem the time, but understand it's because the days are evil. I want you to stop and listen to me. When you start to set New Year's resolutions, some things have to get very real. And one of the things that have to get very real is, and I've got a lot of my buddies that are pretty incredible fellas, and they're really positive guys, and they really have got a vision for setting a goal and keeping after it. And I like those guys. I like being around those guys because they're tenacious about being goal setters. But I've got another set of friends that are just like that, but their philosophy in life is I never look at what is evil, wrong, or negative, because those things will weigh me down. Watch my lips. You cannot exist in the world if you don't recognize your enemy. The writer says that the days are evil. According to the scriptures, Satan is going around like a roaring lion. He's out to confuse, and he's constantly trying to distract you. Excuse me. I had a few years back that one of the, and this was several years, it's probably been over a decade back, and one of the couple wasn't getting along well. And so they both decided individually, independent of each other, they were just going to get super fit. And they did that, and they were incredibly fit. And they both individually went their own way, did their own thing, and got incredibly fit. There's only one problem. They ignored the reality of what was going on in their marriage by getting fit. Everybody congratulated them. Everybody patted them on the back. But can you see that they missed the point of the bigger issues? The enemy's going to tempt you to glorify yourself. I want you to ask this simple question. How many of your New Year's resolutions, if you're making them, centered towards, I want everybody to look at me and see how well I've done. God's call in my life is to live to the glory of God. There's a temptation when I start to set the goals in my life that I don't recognize the days of evil, and that unfortunately many of the goals that I might set in, many of the resolutions have this tint to it. It goes through this filter. Daggone it, I've got rights, and I'm going to do what's good for me. And while that has merit in some people's lives in a certain context, the problem is the minute I start demanding my rights, I start moving against what Christ called me to, because a person that's been crucified doesn't have any rights. The enemy tempts us to use my own wisdom. I don't search out from other brothers and sisters, and I certainly don't search out from the Lord. And finally this, the enemy is completely attempting to deceive your friends and your family. And Christ's call on your life is to care desperately enough for them, to share with them in a way that they can receive it, if at all possible, to understand the deception that they're under. Now, I'd like to be very practical with you. I think there's some mistakes that people make in resolutions. I'm just going to list them quickly here for. First of all, when you start making a change because others want you to, and that's the only reason you're doing it, you're never going to make it. Now understand, we're looking through the filter of what I believe God would call us to do, is to walk circumspectively, be very careful how I'm walking, recognizing that the days are evil. So use wisdom and do that. So here's some wisdom. Don't just make a decision about resolutions because others want you to. Sometimes I make resolutions because I'm trying to deal with the pain of my internal hurts. Well, I'm glad you're dealing with the pain of your internal hurts, but one, that only works temporarily. And how about instead going for the real issue that's happening? Resolutions depend on other people's behavior. When I make a resolution that actually depends on somebody else following through with something for me, it's doomed from the beginning. Here's another one. People make the mistake of ignoring that they failed in the past and how they failed in the past. Number 5, failure is not allowed in any of my resolutions. I can't tell you the number of times that I talk to people who are incredibly disappointed because they define themselves on whether or not they were able to do this thing, this great resolution that they were planning on being involved with, and it did not allow for the fact that there could be failure along the way. It's totally centered on myself. Number 7, I have a limited knowledge of what I need. So let me give you an example. How many of you, just in the natural realm, have watched kids before, and they think they know what they need, and they're convinced that they know all that there is to know in life? And you tell them and warn them that that's not wise, and it can be very young to quite a bit older, and they look at you like you've got 4 eyes and a giant protruding wart coming off the center of your face. They completely think you're stupid. But suddenly, much later on, you see the great wisdom. My wife tells me on several occasions, if I hear one more thing that your dad said that was full of wisdom, I'm just going to throw up. Honestly, I don't remember. I know I'm an old guy now, but I don't remember one stupid thing my dad ever said now. The majority of the stuff that he told me was dead on. I recognize that, excuse me, and the same thing can happen, the mistake in resolutions. I get on this mode that I know what I'm doing. I ignore my need for other support. And again, I will remind you of the phrase. Use that phrase. It says, oh, it's all good. It's all good. And what that means is I don't want to talk about it. You do what you want to do, and I do what I want to do. God did not design us to operate independently of each other. Right? He didn't. But I'm telling you, and I don't want to get way off on this, on the American church, we all come to church on Sunday, but then act like we don't need each other for the rest of the week. When you start talking about life change that happens, and especially that life change that requires a move from the Almighty God, you cannot maintain it apart from yourself. So here's a few tips. First of all, recognize God assumes there's already a plan in place. Now, the truth is you can do whatever you want, plan whatever you want for your business, buy whatever you want to buy, but it all comes in the context of what the greater plan that God has given the Christ follower. So, recognize as you make your plans that you have an enemy. If you're going to do well with making resolutions for the new year, it demands that you invite regular review in my life. So let me just, I know I'm speaking incredibly deep and profound right now, so let me just break it down for you. Answer one simple question for me. Is there anybody that you've had a conversation with in the last 3 months? See, I'm being very generous. That you've said, here's the thing that I believe that God wants to have happen in my life. Here's the thing that I think is a place of weakness, or a place that he wants me to go to make a place of strength in my life. And said, listen, would you ask me about that, and would you pray for me about that? Don't raise your hands. I just want to know, because if we're going to be very real about this, because if the answer to your question is no, or if it's almost none, then what it's revealing is that you are a great churchgoer, but you have not placed yourself in a position to let the God of this universe and his people take you to the place that God would desire to take you. I would suggest to you that you look to see what else is out there. What's coming from my blind spot? By the way, have you ever noticed a blind spot is kind of hard to see because you can't see it? Which again assumes that you got other people involved in your life. Anytime you start to make resolutions that don't recognize where your weak spots are, and there are people, I'll remind you of the one psychologist that says this, that one of the things that people mess up on their resolutions is they actually don't see there anything that would stand in the way at all for them. And so the problem is not that they didn't set a good goal, but they didn't recognize that there's 4 things that usually happen when they go after that goal that completely undoes them. And so what that psychologist would tell you is go after the stuff that you're weak in. And if you want a goal, go after those small things, those small goals that have kept you from getting you to the place you'd like to be, that God might be leading you. I would suggest to you, number 6, that you clear a path for the coming attack. If you think that there's a place that you want to go, and before God you're saying, God, in my heart of hearts, I want to go there. Recognize that there's evil in this world, and his name is Satan and his cronies, and he is out to steal, kill, and destroy your joy. Number 7, forget comparing yourself to other people, because somebody always outdoes you, except the problem is I usually compare. When I do the comparison thing, I compare myself to people that are really bad at what I want to do well, so the bar is pretty low. So I have this false sense of I'm doing awesome because everybody around me are bums. Number 8, come to God relative to any goals, any visions, any New Year's resolutions with an empty bag, meaning, God, there's nothing I can do here, with open ears to hear him and a surrendered heart that no matter what he asks you to do, even if it interrupts this resolution that you have for the future, saying it is all good doesn't make it so. Living in denial for the rest of your life does not fix the things of life, and more specifically, it does not move you on to maturity in your relationship with Christ. And so I would like to suggest to you in simple terms, in view of the filter of that you should walk circumspectively, being wise and not unwise, and understand that you should do this because the days are evil. The first thing I'd suggest to you is this. First step in setting your actual resolves in life for this year. 1, I can't, but God can. You see, we have a tendency to base our ability and our success in making changes on our willpower. Now, I don't want you to check out on me because this is one of those things you say when you're in church, but nobody talks about outside. But I want you to see this. That does not represent the life of a Christ follower. The Christian life is this, Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. However, dead people don't have a whole lot of power. Have you noticed that? Making positive changes in our lives, definitely honors God. But seeking to make those changes because you got tough and you have not depended one iota on Christ actually dishonors Him. He tells us this in Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6. It is not by might and not by power, but by your Spirit, says the Lord. Your strategy for keeping whatever resolutions you want to do may be, if it needs to be, total dependence on God and accessing His power as you're listening to Him all the time. Number two, it's important that you recognize that you're God's child and that you give your life to His will. The important question about resolution is why. Some people, sometimes we pray and we say this. We ask God to make a change that we want to have in life, and we don't understand why our prayers go unanswered. Well, newsflash. James chapter 4, verse 3. When you ask, you don't get it because your motives are wrong. You want what pleases you. You need translation on that? I don't. It's pretty direct. You see, a Christian is someone who has decided to live in a way that, Lord, whatever you say, I do. Even if I thought I needed to have this resolution, but you were actually trying to do this other bigger thing. You see, here's what I've recognized. I have for about 2 years now been compulsing, maybe more than that, 3, on trying to lose weight because I shouldn't have put on the weight. What God's been begging me to do is to grieve with Him because He cares for me. And He can take on the burden of this incredible loss that I've had. I wonder if you're the same way. I wonder if you found yourself centering a focus where it really doesn't belong. A Christian is someone who's desired to live in a particular way. Whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the what? The glory of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. Whether you're resolving to eat better, eat more vegetables, drink more water, quit drinking, quit doing porn, and a whole host of other things, work on my marriage. Here's the point. You're not to be doing those things because you're on this great self-improvement plan so you can feel so good because you accomplished those things. The heart for every believer as they set any resolution, whether it's on the first day of the new year or it's all throughout the year, is very simply this. Lord, I'm living to your glory and may whatever I'm doing. So I want you to dream big plans for your businesses. I want you to dream big plans for your family and for your church and for your own life. But recognize that God has called you to more. Number 3, I ask God to help me own and release my past. I work with a lot of people who need to make a lot of changes. And I find a recurring theme happens. What is keeping them from the way they want to live in the future is the way they've lived in the past. In my life, for years, there's several things that I've tried to deal with impatience and anger. And I could never deal with any of it until I dealt with the issues that were causing it. So this year, as you start to do your resolutions, whatever you're doing that you don't want to do or not do that you want to do, again, the question is this: why? Why do you overeat or exercise too much or smoke or look at porn or yell at your kids or have bitterness towards your parents? To change, the beginning place is for you to own and release whatever is the enemy's using in your life to create those symptoms. And if you don't know how to do it, you need to ask. Winding down, number 4, he says this, with God's help, I'll always forgive and ask to be forgiven. When I start thinking about the past, often I discover that there's issues of unforgiveness. And I'm going to tell you this morning, I don't often say this, but My first thought when I wrote this down as a part of the sermon was, this doesn't need to be a part of the sermon. But then I realized just how many times I personally have been caught in this. It could be guilt about an action or criticism about someone else's sin that keeps getting me stuck. But we don't realize how guilt and resentment can stain our lives and infect everything. And as a matter of fact, we get stuck with all of that. I want to encourage you that if you have guilt over your transgressions, the things you've done wrong, or bitterness about sin committed against you, make forgiveness your top priority this year. Receiving forgiveness or giving forgiveness will impact absolutely every single other area of your life. Step 5, stay connected to God and to other people. I think it's wise, just incredibly wise, to include God and a few close friends in deciding your New Year's resolutions. As a matter of fact, coming up between now and the summer, there's going to be several tools we're going to give you to help you grow in your walk with Christ, to help facilitate. It's not that they're the only tools that you can use. One of those is the thing that we call snapshots. And all snapshots is going to be is a little evaluation that you'll make on yourself. It's going to look at 3 different primary areas in your life: what you believe, how you act, and the character, the virtues of your life. And have you evaluate where you're at with that, and then say, these are the big things that I would like for God to work on me. I recognize these things are weaknesses, or they're just areas that I've never addressed in my own life. And then we're going to ask you to do something that's a little bit intimidating. We're not going to make you. We don't make anybody do anything around here. But we're going to invite you to take your results from your test and say, these are my goals for this year, and to share them. If you're in a community experience, we're going to be talking with the community group leaders, and they're going to lead the facilitating your community group about how you can do that. But we're going to give other opportunities to do that, both individually and in some classes that will offer short-term classes to help you start beginning to make an honest evaluation about where you are in your walk with Christ, and I don't care how long you've been in your walk with Christ, and what you'll do next. You see, connecting with God and close family helps me keep those resolutions that I might set in life. Your strategy for faithful living out the new you is connection. How will you stay connected to God on purpose? What's your plan for accessing His power? Do you even know what that means? Who are your friends that you'll be asking to pray for you and hold you accountable? And finally, I just say this as I close. The 6th step was very simply this. There's a saying in the recovery movement that says there's no healing without helping. There can be something selfish about just setting a resolve that only does self-improvement for you. But I seem to get unstuck when I start giving myself to others and helping them invest their lives for the kingdom of God. As Randy comes forward, I would tell you this while you're at it. When you think about your need to live in 2019, what about living out the highest priority that God's called you to? Jesus' final marching orders was this: as you go into the world, preach the gospel. He wasn't talking about this whole idea of some big preacher showing up in the city to preach. But as you're doing what you do as you sell flowers, as you're doing what you do as you're being an engineer, as you're doing whatever you're doing as you go, to share this amazing man, Jesus, that'll transform people's lives forever.